Welcome to the Together We Can Climate Solutions event. My name is Freya Cole. I'm the Media and Investigations Manager at the Australian Conservation Foundation, Australia's national environment organisation. Now, we're hot in the middle of a hotly contested federal election, so this is a disclosure. The Australian Conservation Foundation is a charity. We are non-partisan. We are funded by the community, and it's really important that you all know that here tonight. We're here for climate solutions because we know that together in the room, we can make a real difference. Now, before we get underway, it is my absolute privilege to welcome Wiradjuri, Yuin and Gadigal woman Nadina Dixon to welcome us to country. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here tonight on stolen land.
Warami. Warami. Budjeri. Ngaya. Budjeri. Just said you're deadly, and you are. So, I'm Nadina Dixon, and my kinship, I have over 6 apical ancestors across the Sydney Basin, from the harbour down at around Sydney Harbour, and then all throughout this area, La Perouse, I've got connections to La Perouse, and also throughout Wongal country, so moving through to Marrickville, all through Dharawal, cross over between the Cooks River and through that area, and then out through Durrag country as well. So my ancestral grandmother lived in the boat sheds in the 1870s at Circular Quay, and she was placed in the Female Training Institute in the Domain. So this was before the one that was built at Parramatta, and she would walk all through this country, and she was in service as a child convict and trained in domestics, as was the traditions of the time. And she would walk through, there's documents of her walking from Woolloomooloo, and that area there was still a lot of Aboriginal people living along the coastline, through Centennial Gardens and out here towards La Perouse along the escarpment. So it's my great honour. She was also the granddaughter of Maria Locke, who was the first Aboriginal child placed in the Parramatta Native Institute. And my family camps all along Kurnell and all along the coastline, and would travel up through the Cooks River system, Coolayara, which is the pelican dreaming, and all throughout Saltpan Creek. And there were a lot of different camps throughout that area and out through to St George's River. So, Ngaya Nadina Dixon, Walama Bemi, Inyana, Bayalawa, Ngaya Ngayalang, Gadigal, Dharawal, Bidjigal Nyura, Ngaya Ngayalang, Budjeri, Darabara. I'd love to welcome everyone here. And I thought we might just do a little bit of quick language, shall we? All right. So we say na, na Nyura, na, na Nyura. We see country, na, yep. We na Nyura. We listen, but we listen deeply from spirit, not from the hearing, not from auditory, but whole body, from a deep place of inner reflection, connection to the mother, sacred mother, Bianga. So we say ngara, ngara, nga. So the tongue sits on the top of the soft palate and drops. Like when we say sing, nga, sing, nga. See, ngara, ngara nyura, ngara nyura. So we hear country, ngara nyura, and biala, biala nyura, biala nyura, na nyura, ngara nyura, Biala Nyura. Budgery. So I just want to close by saying welcome everyone and acknowledge our elders. I'm an emerging elder that's been training in ceremony for 3 or 4 years, and so it's my great honour to welcome everyone and to thank you for your powerful work that you're doing to protect country and to look after the mother. So, yano. And I'll just say one last thing, which is Nangamai, Māori, Nangamai, dream big dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadina. And Nadina's exactly right. We're all here for deep listening and deep conversation, and I can't wait to get started. Folks, climate damage is here now. I really want you to walk out of this room tonight feeling like there is hope and that we need to act this crucial decade. But we can't kid ourselves. Already this year, hundreds of residents across northern New South Wales and Queensland have been forced to flee their homes from catastrophic, unprecedented, record-breaking, deadly floods. It's less than 2 years since the air here in Sydney was smothered, suffocated by toxic smoke from the Black Summer bushfires. But I know we're all here because we care, and we need to feel positive because there are brilliant people who I've got up here with me who are working on solutions. The climate solutions to fix this huge problem are here now. So without any further ado, I'd like each panellist to introduce themselves and give a brief 1 to 2 minutes about the work they do. Saul, I promised I wouldn't go to you first.
I was going to say, you promised if I sat here, I wouldn't go first. I'm Saul Griffith. I grew up in Bardell Park, just a little bit over there. I left Australia on a one-way ticket to Alaska when I was 19, to my mother's chagrin. Spent a lot of time in America ever since, building technology companies, nearly all of them focused on energy and climate solutions. I'm really happy to say that I moved back here last year, and I founded an organisation called Rewiring Australia to advocate for very rapid adoption of climate solutions, and that organisation is advocating for electrification of everything as really the near-term climate policy that we can actually implement in this country, not vague solutions that are 10 years out, things we can do today. And I just wrote a book called The Big Switch, which prosecutes that case, and I'm delighted to be a ratbag in this election and try to get the right climate policies to happen in this country.
Is that one on? Oh, good. I am also a rat bag, Saul. We've rat bagged together via our mutual love of the climate movement. I started out as a, just to use another term. Oh, yeah, I'm Sarah Wilson. I do forget that every now and then. I'm Sarah Wilson. I started my career in mainstream media, as mainstream as it gets. I think Mumbrella once described me as the media tart of Australia because I have, in fact, worked for every media organisation, including News Corp. I was the editor of Cosmo. I was the host of MasterChef Australia. I then converted, and I've been a climate activist for about 15 years. I've written a bunch of books. I started the I Quit Sugar movement and moved into the anxiety space and wrote a book called First We Make the Beast Beautiful. I lived on the road for 8 years out of one bag. I spend nothing, buy nothing. And I eventually gave away all of the profits from I Quit Sugar to a charity, which actually comes up this evening, I think, in one of my answers. And then I wrote a book that was about paving a way for hope, philosophical and aesthetic hope through the climate crisis, which was called This One Wild and Precious Life. I'm now a podcaster and generally make absolutely not a cent.
Me too.
Hi, I'm Mike Rann, and I'm the chair of the Climate Group, which is an organisation headquartered in London, which has a membership of 260 subnational governments, California, New York, many of the state governments around the world of Germany, India, here in Australia, but also on 5 continents. We've also got 500 corporations who have signed up and are committed by 2030 to be totally zero carbon emissions. And before that, I started in New Zealand as one of the co-founders of Greenpeace 49 years ago, and then later on became Premier of South Australia, and I appointed myself Climate Change Minister, and we went from 0 renewable energy, and we're currently at over 60%, will be 100% renewable by 2030, and will be 500% renewable by 2050. And just on that, the highest penetration of solar rooftops and also wind, this is per capita, in the world.
I'm Anthony. I'm one of the co-founders of the Good Car Company. I love electric cars for all that they unlock in being able to decarbonise both transport and energy. And I love working with people because we're the driving force behind this change. I'm an energy and EV nerd, and I love science communication. That's it.
Let's check the next one. Yep. So, hi guys. I'm Nadina Dixon. I'm a adjunct professor at UTS with a specialisation in embedding Indigenous perspectives into art and design practice with a focus on decolonising methodologies. I grew up quite traditional, moving in and out of Aboriginal communities. I spent a lot of time as a child in my extended kinship, which goes as far as the Victorian border. I'm 52, so a lot of my family was still quite nomadic and not very westernised. So I spent my time in Aboriginal communities that were really quite independent. Like, we were 60 k's out of town and none of my elders were educated. So we lived off traditional knowledge. My mother's people were also down at Wreck Bay near Jervis Bay. And so it's rugged bushland. So I learnt to track when I was a child and to read country. And we were still following traditional knowledges of the star constellation patterns and how that affected the tides and the seasons. So my knowledge of climate and climate history, which I was amazed to learn from our senior elders, goes back into our talking memory 17,000 years ago, back to the last ice age across the Sydney Basin. And so we have creation stories that talk about how our people had to change the direction of walking from the south coast through to Sydney because the sea levels had risen 17,000 years ago. And so a lot of this is still talked about as if it was maybe 10 years ago, you know, and these great epic intertribal feasts and ceremonies around the whale cycles. So it's been a very powerful time the last 2 years to be involved with climate justice, and I'm continuing to do the work of my grandfather, the late Dr. Charles Dixon, who was a freedom fighter that was heavily involved in the 67 referendum for Aboriginal people, and also a strong advocate for land rights and for access to maintain ceremonial practices on country.
And hello everyone, and everyone online as well. I'm Kelly O'Shannessy, and I'm very fortunate to be the CEO of the Australian Conservation Foundation, our national environment group. And I was just telling everyone before that my full name is Kelly Ann O'Shannessy, which is the initialised chaos. And I grew up in a town called Anarchy, so I'm just saying professional ratbag down this end, okay? And it's not my fault, it was in the destiny. But in fact, I have worked in business and government and now the non-profit sector, and I probably would find it very difficult to give up advocacy, because it's just about changing what is to what should be, to things to be better. And I wanted in our environment movement to welcome everyone, no matter where you grew up or where you were born or how you vote or how you have your cup of coffee in the morning, to feel like if you love nature, you can be a part of standing up for it. And so that's what we do at ACF. We love nature for its inherent value, and we're willing to stand up to protect nature and to act on climate because of the people we love. And we know for a safe world, we need to take action now. And that's what we get to do every day. So it's kind of fun.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for mentioning the folks at home. Due to the pandemic, we have a pretty big following of people joining from right across Australia, and we had around 2,000 RSVPs to this web stream. So if you're watching, hello, and thank you to our tech crew for getting it all set up so professionally. Now, Together We Can is ACF's priority campaign. The aim of Together We Can is to reach new audiences. This federal election, the next Australian government will be surrounded by individuals, small businesses, big businesses, grassroots partners, financial institutions, of people who want stronger climate action, and at the very least, 50% emissions reduction by 2030. So Together We Can is bringing in a whole bunch of new people, and we're really proud of this campaign. It's really starting to hit some new audiences who we wouldn't usually be talking to, and as Australia's National Environment Organisation, that's something we're really focusing on. Now, Saul, I know you didn't want to sit here because I'm always going to come to you first, but you've done some brilliant work in America, and we are very, very happy to have you home in Australia because we need it. I'm curious. So, powering our communities with clean energy, how do we make it happen? How do we make it happen faster?
So, we are still the luckiest country, even though in the original penning of those words they meant we were lucky in spite of our politicians. In the contemporary interpretation, we are still the luckiest country. So if you looked around the world, you know, I was actually in the US, I wrote a book called Electrify that was basically a love letter to the incoming president. I wrote it during the American primaries. Unfortunately, Liz Warren didn't get up. Biden's a good guy, but to be honest, and I still work with this is going online, so I shouldn't say this, but we still work with the White House trying to help America get the best climate result they can under this administration. But if you remember the first day I'll bring this back to Australia, but the first day of the Biden administration, they said 50% emission reductions by 2030. That was a moment for celebration. It was the first science-based target of a major Western nation. I was really happy for about 2 weeks. I think if you're very realistic about what's happening politically in America, you have to believe that they might get to 15, 20% reductions, and most of that will just come from what the auto industry is doing there. Really, even though we're having one last shot at goal on getting the climate provisions in Build Back Better through, still being sort of blocked. While I was writing that book and doing that work in the US, looked at Australia and realised that I was always telling the story to the White House about the Australian rooftop solar miracle. If only America could do what Australia succeeded at, which was making rooftop solar deliver the cheapest electricity that any consumer in the world has ever received direct to the Australian household. And if you could do that in America and power their electric trucks, everything would be great. It's not going to happen there at the speed we want. So then if you're looking for the next, a new theory of change, how do you speed up the climate action we need by a decade? Honestly, the gift that Australia could now give to the world is to show the world how to do it. If you had Australian rooftop solar policy Californian electric vehicle policy and roughly Korea-Japanese electric heat pump policy for our building and space heat. That's the recipe. It's not happening in one location anywhere in the world yet. The location where it happens first will save the most money, and although I like to think I'm saving the planet because I like the koalas and the pelicans, I don't think we're going to get everyone aligned with that. So let's talk money to the Australian people, because I think that's how you make the tent bigger, in the spirit of Together We Can movement. The reality is that those technologies are 1 or 2 years away from saving money for every Australian household. By 2030, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year. The recipe is simple. You've got to electrify your cars, you've got to electrify your heating systems, you electrify your kitchen, you put solar on the roof, you put a battery on the side of your house. That's now national infrastructure. It's 5 decisions. Stop sweating the plastic bags. That is still a problem, will still be a problem. But let's make these 5 decisions really well, help every Australian household do that, and we'll save enormous amounts of money. Why focus on that? That's because I think we got stuck in Australian climate policy for 2 decades fighting about what we have to lose, the abstract things, what happens in the export economy next decade, what are we going to replace coal export revenues with, et cetera, and we haven't had the conversation in Australia about what we have to win. Well, we have, and the Greens and organisations like you said, we've got to win the incredible Australian landscape and environment, but that wasn't enough in the culture wars. So I think now we need to fight back the culture war on the front lines and say, look, Australia, you're still the luckiest country. You can have your utes, they're going to be electric, the donuts will be sweet. You can have the jet skis. The jet skis will be quiet, you'll be able to tow the boat. The electric cars are coming. This is a little bit, there's a piece of me that's like, grew up hoping that Greenpeace succeeded in everything they did, and it's like, that message is a little bit in conflict with the 1980s environmentalist message. But actually, I think it's actually achievable now that we could have that big dream. I think that's how we make a bigger tent. And really, they're the only emissions that we can eliminate this decade. 42% of emissions in Australia in our domestic economy are decisions you make at your kitchen table about what's in your house. Another 25% if you include small businesses that do the same thing. They drive, they heat their water. We can do that immediately. Australians have had the success of the rooftop solar. God, this has turned into a total pitch.
I'm sold.
Sold. Good. But, I think this is how we address a whole bunch of issues in Australia, cost of living issues that are now front of mind for a huge number of Australians, particularly since Putin made cost of petrol go up. We were told that we should fear losing our $80 billion coal and natural gas export industries. They talk about the total value of it. Most of it's owned by offshore interests, but we only make $10 or $20 billion on that. We spend $32 billion on petrol and diesel every year. So we are net negative on our fossil fuel job-creating economy already today. We can be so hugely positive if we're using our cheap Australian sunshine to drive electric cars, heat our homes. I think the good news is we can do it. The better news is if Australia really embarks on this project at scale, at the conclusion of this election, and I have had positive indications that there are people in the coalition who would like to subscribe to this, there are people in Labor who would subscribe to this, and practically all of the independents want to subscribe to this. If Australia can do that, do it in 2023, 2024, start to show the world how to do it, we will bring forward climate action by a decade from America and Europe. And so we now can be unbelievably globally significant by way of just saying, here's how you do it.
So here's how we do it. I'm sure Anthony will want to jump in a second, but Mike, I'm really curious to go to you, former Premier of South Australia. How do we start to get governments, people in the halls of power, positions of power, to start listening to the genius of Saul Griffith?
I guess one of the issues is ultimately it comes down to, and I totally agree with what Saul said, it basically comes down to explaining to people, the hard yakka of explaining to people the benefits. So for instance, I got pretty much beaten up. We didn't ever have a majority in the upper house. Beaten up over what was called my obsession on renewable energy. But you know what? It was worth a hell of a lot to us. We had, at one stage, with 7% of the population of Australia, we had 66% of the investment, not government money or taxpayers' money, in wind in a very small state. And eventually the other states kind of woke up and thought, well, hang on a minute. Well, we just simply made it easier for investment. We made them feel welcome. And, you know, the mention of plastic bags. We passed legislation to ban non-reusable plastic bags. I had people in my own party saying that this was a disaster. I had a line-up of businesses saying it would be devastating for the retail industry. It's all frog shit, and they're all supported by the Murdoch press. And the fact is that we went ahead and did it. We saved 500 million plastic bags going into the environment. The public loved it. I used to like a figure called 50.1%. We had 80% support for what we're doing in that area, and 90% of people under the age of 30. And the same was true in terms of renewables. I had people telling me that, I was obsessed, this was going to cost us. We then did a video of me talking about a whole range of policy areas, and we wormed it. You know the worms that are on TV debates? As soon as I started talking about South Australia being a renewable leader nationally and internationally, it was like a Cape Canaveral rocket going off. So the problem is that people, and we've seen what's happened in the last few weeks with the front pages around the country, there is vested interest trying to not only scare the public, but also scare the politicians off. And it's really interesting. Australians actually like being leaders. And I think that we've got to have much more faith in the public on this. And Don Dunstan was the first person I worked for when I came over from New Zealand. He was a brilliant politician. He said you've got to get elected, re-elected, and re-elected again to actually embed things. And the great news was that when we finally got tossed out of office after 16 years, the Liberals who'd attacked me all along reversed their policies. And I actually had the Premier, who just recently was defeated again, sending me a message that we were right. We were right from the start. I mean, that is, by the way, a relief. We've got to get bipartisanship going, and we've got to find allies everywhere. But meanwhile, just always look at where the money trail, and the money trail is coming from the fossil fuel industry, who currently feel under threat. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, who regard Australia as a pariah, massive trillions of dollars of investment is now switching into renewables and sustainability.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Australia does like being leaders, but we're not, are we? I mean, it was very obvious at the COP26 in Glasgow, we were right down the bottom. But I do think, money does talk. But I will come to Kelly in a bit around that, because we're very passionate about nature at ACF. So I do want to come back to that, Kelly, that point. But let's go to EVs. I want to see a show of hands. I'm going to ask two questions. Who here drives an EV? Yeah. And who would like to drive an EV, but they're too bloody expensive? Okay. Anthony, over to you. Talk to us. I mean, you don't need to do a pitch. It's pretty obvious, okay. But I want to know about road transport emissions, what we can do to make EVs more accessible.
Well, I think I just want to touch on that point about Australians like to be leaders, and it's whether it's happening at that higher level or whether it's just everyday Australians all the time. Like if you go and stop at a charging station and there's somebody there with an EV, everybody's going to stop and have a chat to you. And that individual leadership that starts to happen, like once people experience it, and to your point of we need to be able to explain what it is, but empowering people to be able to explain, also giving them the tools to explain how awesome and easy it is just to have an electric vehicle. And I'm not a car person. I didn't love cars. And I still say it's much better to get public transport or ride a bike or walk. But EVs are really damn cool, and they're faster. They're so much faster. They're cleaner, they're quieter, and it's just a better experience. And I think once people have that general, like that hands-on experience, it's really hard to go back and not become an advocate and a raving pariah for how great EVs are. And I think that's the way that we're going to get big change, is through that experiential process. So the main thing is just that people have experience and exposure to it. And we don't really get that because we're so far behind the 8 ball in terms of becoming a market for electric vehicles. We have some of the shittiest EV policies in the world on a federal level. I mean, the states are going it alone and they're doing a fantastic job, but that's not enough to be able to make the entire market shift towards Australia. To start off with, we're a really small market, and it's really hard to prioritise us over, Europe, UK, the States, China, where the bulk of the EV sales will go. But then those manufacturers of the automobiles, they sell internal combustion vehicles, petrol, diesel, and even hybrids, and they get penalised for every gram of CO2 that comes out of the tailpipes. And so they offset those sales or those penalties by selling electric vehicles into those markets. And so foregoing those benefits to prioritise some stream of cars to Australia, it just isn't going to happen anytime soon unless we get serious about it. Living in an apartment as well, yeah. So, that's it, having some of the public charging infrastructure in there, but also like our identity that we have around being Australians that need to own a car and that need to drive 1,000 k's to go across the Nullarbor. Like, most of us do live in the cities and we drive 30, 40 k's a day, and maybe car ownership isn't a thing that we need to really consider, that there's other alternative models out there.
So I can hear lots of chatter and it's awesome. And I really want to encourage, we're going to get to questions from the audience in a moment. We could sit and talk about EVs all night, I reckon, but I really want to start. I'm going to bring Sarah in because it's been brought up twice already, 3 times potentially, but the Murdoch press. It's been brought up twice. And the scare campaign by the Murdoch press has also been brought up. So Sarah, I'm really curious to hear from you. I'm also a reformed commercial television journalist. I've also worked for the BBC, so I like to think that balances me out a little bit, and here I am tonight. But Sarah, you're a person of influence, and you've got a really big platform, and you're doing some brilliant work in mainstreaming climate activism. How do we work with the likes of the Murdoch press, and why do you think that's important?
Oh, well, yes, I actually started out, I'll top your story there. My first job at News Corp was as a opinion writer, and I shared a page on a Friday with Andrew Bolt. It wasn't a he says, she says kind of romance column or anything like that. I was actually the ballast, I think. I was 23 and I wrote about left-leaning stuff. So I've got to confess, I've always had a bit of a leave pass with the Murdoch press. If I was missing a leg or something, then I would have ticked off a few more boxes, but I was their token left-wing female young voice. And I was happy with that. I'm glad it was me, not somebody else. I suppose I have always felt that you need to preach to the unconverted, because that is where, and we were talking about this earlier, the Yale study, and there's an equivalent that was done here in Australia at Monash, which shows that really there's sort of 5 segments. And of course, there's those who are activated, and I suspect it's most people in this room. And then there's 1 layer or 2 layers beneath them who are the bulk of Australians who are concerned yet don't know how to activate their alarm into action. And so that's, I guess, the audience I speak to, and I've always aimed at that audience. In terms of how you do it, and so in terms of working with the Murdoch press, we have to start to swing them around, and the trick is to actually find messages that can work, and that's what I spend my entire life doing. And people often say, well, what works, what doesn't, what can we do? The thing that I've drilled it down to is we have to make this new way of being sexier or more charming than the status quo. Humans do not change their behaviour unless the new way is sexier and more appealing and more charming. And there's different ways of doing that. When I wrote my latest book, I drilled it down to the fact that at our fundamental core, we will fight to the bitter end to save what we truly love. And so really a lot of what I do is try to connect people to what they truly love. And at the end of the day, it is our connection with nature. And so what the ACF does is really important. It can't be all that we do because, of course, the climate movement, the environment movement suffered from really focusing on saving the koalas and forgetting the message that actually, you know what, that will saving the planet will be fine. Is it George Carlin, the American comedian? You've got to watch that clip on YouTube. It's brilliant. But the planet will be fine. It's us that will be fucked. And this is the message that we've had to share. So you've got to do alarm, and then you've also got to do hope. And it's the bouncing backwards and forwards constantly. We need to work to dot points of 3 or 5 items. In Saul's case, just the one, electrify everything. And, you know, I mean, I've got 5 dot points, and, you know, what can you do? And it's electrify everything's definitely in there, Saul. You'll be glad to know. I think it's point number 2. But, of course, at the moment, it's vote climate. You know, just vote climate. We have got the best opportunity, and that's what we all need to be focusing our energies on. And I know we're represented here by some of the Allegra's team and the Voices of Wentworth. But that is the incredible opportunity. So the other problem I'll just throw in here, and some of you might be familiar with it, is the danger of getting people, individuals, to feel like it's all on their shoulders. And that is a tactic of the fossil fuel industry. It's actually coming out at the moment. Over the last couple of months, there's been a number of studies that have shown the extent to which they have influenced the whole recycling campaign of the last 20 years. And that is to enable them to keep making plastic. And so we're going to see more and more of this as, you know, energy divests to renewables. They're going to have to do something with their fossil fuels, and so plastic is the solution. Back to George Carlin, because I think he said the meaning of life is plastic, didn't he? He drilled it all down to that. You've got to go and watch this YouTube video. It's brilliant. So I feel that we've got to be very careful about putting it onto individuals' shoulders and steering individual action more to sort of voting and so on. So it's a really difficult dance, and I pulse backwards and forwards between all the approaches and really try to go where the message is working. And at the moment, for anyone who's interested, and this has come up, I think, 2 or 3 times already, is this idea of leadership. We have to be the message we want to see, and that's very much resonating. And the other thing that's resonating on the Instagrams at the moment is exposing what our reputation is on the international stage. And I've done a bunch of videos which basically shows a whole bunch of graphs where we're literally the shittest. We are literally at the bottom. And, you know, was it the Climate Change Performance Index, the 2022 one that came out sort of just after COP, even with our net zero by 2050 policy, we came out as having having zero climate policy. We're the bottom of the world, underneath Kazakhstan and Saudi Arabia. And when I bring those things out, that's working at the moment. Nobody wants to be last. We don't want to be the shittest in the world. We're used to being the best. And so that's something that it's working at the moment. I've sort of done an extended answer to your question.
Love it. No, it's really interesting stuff. I do want to circle back to one of ACF's favourite topics, and that's nature. So we've all heard of carbon capture and storage. It's part of the federal government's so-called plan. But we all know that the best carbon capture and storage is in trees. It's so obvious. I think I learnt it in Warrnambool Primary School Year 2. It's really basic science. Kelly, we've talked a little bit about the Save the Koala campaign. Now, to be honest, that's really serious. Koalas are now endangered across New South Wales and Queensland. They're one species that is if we want to see our kids and grandkids see koalas in the wild, we really do need to act. But I suppose the problem with, Kelly, and I'll come to you, with focusing just on the koala, it kind of doesn't capture the enormity of the problem. So talk us through why you think nature is a climate solution and why we should be trying to let Australians know, and Nadina, please do jump in as well, why nature is a solution that's here now and ready to go.
Well, I think your grade 2 primary school teacher explained that one pretty well. You know, there's this wonderful thing called a tree or a plant or algae or mangroves, and they sequester carbon dioxide. And humanity has really cut those things down at great rate of knots. So Australia is a global leader in extinction. And for a highly intelligent, developed nation, that's appalling. So we are number 1 in the world with mammalian extinctions, and we are in the top 3 in the world for extinction.
So we're not shit at everything.
No, hey, yes, good news. Well done. And it's because we're ripping down our forests, and some koalas live in those forests. Now, we know we can fix that because we can protect nature, and we are working very hard to create laws in Australia that will actually protect nature and stop the extinction crisis. And we're also working, this is a bit of good news actually, the globe is working on a global agreement for nature, like the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement for Climate. There's one being negotiated right now across the world for nature, and the goal of that is to end extinction by 2030 and to end deforestation. And start having a nature-positive world. So we want to bring that back to Australia for a nature-positive Australia and start rebuilding habitat. And if we do that, we'll help solve the climate crisis. It's probably 10 to 15% of the solution. And so we don't want it to be used as a reason why we slow down the shift to renewables, or we keep building horribly polluting new gas mines. And I've been talking to a lot of folks in business about markets and how markets can be used to protect and rehabilitate nature. They're not at the moment. The markets are not credible at the moment, but we can work to make them credible. And then there's of course, nature is important in its own right. There's some places you just can't ever destroy because they're incredibly important. So we do need those strong nature protection laws.
Nadina, I'm curious to come to you. You mentioned Indigenous perspectives and your generations before you, the traditional knowledge. And I think that's something, everyone here in the room, we really need to recognise that Indigenous-led climate solutions are another thing that's here, it's been here since time immemorial. I really want to hear from you, Nadina, about just how this country can start to take First Nations voices on caring for country. How do we do it better?
I'm just speaking from the teachings of my senior elders, you know, and how we were given the laws by a creator on how to live on country respectfully, and we're not the top of the food chain, you know. So in our sort of contemporary level of intelligence, we're the only animal form that will dirty its own drinking water. So that kind of reflects the intelligence of a child. And when you allow a child to run your home, they're going to eat cake instead of carrots, aren't they, you know? And so we place at our highest priority money. Now, if we can't be taught a lesson by Mother Earth, and we've been through every catastrophe over the last couple of years that you could imagine, that somewhat resembles Moses's battle against the Pharaoh. And I think maybe the only thing we haven't had are the locusts, but I do remember we had the rats or the mice. So maybe that was our version. Do you know what I mean? So my senior elders taught us that, you know those hippies out there hugging the trees? He said we should be all out there hugging the trees because they're breathing for us. And when we start to understand that our survival, when we get to a point where we suffered enough and the droughts and the grief and the loss and the communities that have been flooded over and over and over again, and we still don't want to believe that global warming and climate disaster is an actual thing. Because I remember like legends where my father's people from around Gundagai were warned by our ancestors not to build the town at Gundagai don't build the town there because that's where the flood zone is. And of course they'd been there for 50 years and we'd been there for millennia. And so we'd seen the big cycles that every 100 years or so, or 150 years, the big giant floods come through. And because they didn't build the town up on higher ground and they'd not ever seen the big cycle of floods come through, my ancestor Yarry had to go out in his canoe and rescue the people one by one that were then underwater. So we've got to start saying who speaks for the river. We've got to stop putting ourselves, because we've proven to ourselves that we will put money before nature, even if it means we don't get to breathe. Do you know what I mean? So maybe we've got to stop having the blind leading the blind and voting in governments who won't make decisions either on just making a judgment call. We've seen that people can make judgment calls when we're at risk of COVID or other kind of pandemics. They just shut things down. They just pull things off the market. They just say, we're not doing this. And somebody takes responsibility for the future so our children can have, you know, futures where animal species continue to thrive.
To thrive, yeah. And Nadina, up in northern New South Wales in Lismore, the Koori Mail there, they said after the floods there's a really urgent need for deep listening, for non-Indigenous folk to sit down and really listen and deep listen and listen to those who have been caring for country for tens of thousands of years. Believe it or not, democracy is part of the work ACF does, and it's a really important time to be talking about our democracy. In February, ACF analysis revealed more than $2 million have been donated from fossil fuel companies to political parties, mostly the two major parties. Mike, Saul, anyone can chime in here. How do we get fossil fuel money out of our democracy?
I mean, I totally agree with that proposition, and it's interesting, years ago, the tobacco industry were huge funders of Australian political parties. And then, of course, eventually, you've got to shame political parties that they cannot possibly accept smokes money, and that happened. I think one side still does. But the fact of the matter is that you've got to do the same when it comes to fossil fuels, so that it's seen as the same as the tobacco industry, because it is. I mean, they're fighting, they know they're now fighting a rearguard action, and so they become more and more desperate in who they're prepared to smear. But that's, I mean, I think that would be a terrific campaign by ACF to actually identify where coal money goes. Be very interesting. I'd be very interested to see that myself, actually.
Take note.
What an extraordinary return on investment they get. So in the budget the past 2 weeks ago, we gave $11.6 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. $7.5 billion is a subsidy to foreign oil producers for mining companies to have diesel to mine with. Thinking that's a terrible deal for the Australian people. That's money that leaves the economy making no jobs, just buying that diesel. I think we should stick the boot into all of these people and tell the Australian public that by virtue of having this pro-fossil fuel policies and subsidies, they are now actually stealing money and stealing the health of your babies and your children. For around the 11.6 billion, if you look at the numbers, you know, yes, and electric cars are expensive today. Most of you recognise that, but most organisations who study these things think 2025, 2026, they'll be the same price in the showroom. If we thought about not the cost of solving climate change, but the investment opportunity as Australians, if we invested $12 billion, and I'm going to say the S word, which is not meant to say in Australia, subsidise the general Australian public into electric vehicles, into more solar on their roofs, just to get those costs down. Right, 10 years ago, we talked about, we were nervous about the subsidy for solar. Turns out to have been a great idea. Now it's the cheapest thing ever and we can phase out the subsidies. We just need to do that for heat pumps, cars, etc. And we need to turn this dialogue around. It relates a little bit to the Murdoch media story. We just we all need to be very vocal that any government that isn't choosing to help every Australian household save money, not send money to countries like Russia and Putin and Saudi Arabia, etc., which is what we're doing with all those subsidies, but keep that money in your community, that's how we win. And like, I'm just going to say this is what it means for Australian communities. You take an average Australian suburb, it's got about 1,000 households in it, they spend about $3.5 to $4 million a year on petrol and diesel that creates one job at the local service station, and half of that job is selling tobacco and sugar to your kids. If those 1,000 households in that suburb, instead of spending that $3,000 a year on that petrol and diesel, were using rooftop solar to drive Ant's electric vehicles, you'd be keeping close to $3.5 million in that community. You'd be creating 100 jobs. Like, think about what happens if you spend $3.5 million a year in a Sydney suburb. Like, after 10 years, everything's gold-plated. You have a new bolo, a new surf life-saving club, tennis courts everywhere, swimming, and you've built so many classrooms. It's amazing. Like, we have an unbelievable opportunity for economic renewal in our communities, and this should be community-oriented, and any government, any corporation that isn't choosing that is choosing to steal money from you and your children, in addition to stealing our trees, stealing our koalas, etc.
So we need to clean up democracy. I'm going to go to the audience, if that's all right, because I think it's really important. We're talking about democracy to open up and grab a couple of questions from the crowd. Now, a few hands up already. That's awesome. I've got one massive favour to ask. Please don't make a statement. Make a question and make them better than the press packs following.
We get to make statements.
Following both the Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison, I want to hear better questions than what journalists are asking them at the moment. So I've got our friend Dan here with the mic. Let's go to the gentleman in the red jumper just near you. If you could stand up, say your name and who your question is directed at, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Rob, and the question is really directed at the panel or
Sure.
Anyone with the media experience. The message is really powerful, and the numbers are very compelling, but we have a monopoly when it comes to the media that won't let this message go out. They have vested interest to make sure the message does not go out. So you talk about getting the message out. How?
Sarah?
I don't think I can answer. I can't solve that one. I don't know what we're going to do about that. But in terms of the broader thing about getting messages out and shifting things, at the moment there's no vested interest in the two major parties to change media laws or to change fossil fuel donation laws. And I do think that in many ways we've got to do it via sort of this new realm of independents and Greens on a crossbench. It's going to be the only way that we can shake things up from a whole range of perspectives this election, and we've got 15 days before we can actually enact that. But I can't see a solution, to be absolutely honest. I think there's inquiries that can be had. I think, Mike, you've probably got more experience in this area at a policy level.
Look, persistence pays off. I mean, you have to be resilient. We got, as I say, the Murdoch press and others belted the hell out of us on a whole range of these fronts. You just keep going. And we did a whole lot of symbolic acts. Symbolism's really important. So we solar-powered the Parliament, the State Library, the Art Gallery, the airport, new convention centre. People who came into those places, kids for instance, could see how much these mini power stations were producing. And we also then started solar powering, or putting, not completely, but putting panels on the roofs of hundreds of schools. And of course it means that you've then got a whole lot of kids who are telling their parents that they want it to be their homes and so on. I mean, I think one of the points that Saul made is that if you look at the price of renewables between 2010 and 2020, here in Australia they dropped 82% in cost. And so eventually people looking at their own bottom line, they suddenly realise, hey, we're getting paid for the amount of renewable energy we're putting into the grid. And that's why about 1 in 3 households in South Australia have got rooftop solar power, and the highest proportion of battery storage. So I think that ultimately It's sort of word of mouth, but it's persistence. You've got to keep going on the TV and the radios and everything else. And quite frankly, we're seeing these papers, the more extreme they get. In the most recent election campaign in South Australia, it was diabolical, as it is currently around Australia, and Labor was able to win convincingly despite them. I thought it was really interesting. On the actual election day, they switched from belting the crap out of us to St. Peter. I thought this was interesting. I'm not quite sure why suddenly when they realised the way that... I was on Channel 7 because I like to speak when I can't be edited. I said one of the things about this campaign, it was a referendum on the influence of the Murdoch press, and it's clearly diminishing.
Yeah, I think it's... thank you. It's a really good question. And I mean, Sarah said there wasn't a solution, but I would say social media, love, hate it. There's a lot. We could sit here and talk all night about climate disinformation on social media. But what I will say from observing in my profession is that Generation Z are highly engaged. They are using TikTok like I've never seen it before. They're using the platform to do video explainers and start to communicate differently. So I do like to think that social media gives a lot of hope as well as a lot of negativity, but that is another solution, that people are actually switching off from traditional media, and deep conversations like what we're having tonight, you know, that is a form of communication. So going home and talking to 3 people about what we've discussed tonight.
Actually, Freya, that's how news is told.
Yeah.
By
Exactly.
your friends and family. That is the number one way people make up their minds about things. So I just wanted to say that, because let's not keep giving the power to the Murdoch and the politicians. Like, we, the democracy, can change the story of this country just by reaching out to the footy clubs and the cricket clubs and our religious institutions and our schools and our workplaces. And that's how I think change can happen.
The other thing I'd just throw in there, on a positive note, I'm not an apologist for Murdoch media by any stretch, but they are often fair weather sailors. And once the message starts to get strong in a particular way, they'll switch allegiances, as per St. Peter, as an example. And I experienced it personally. 12 years ago, I was trolled mercilessly by the Murdoch media about how I was basically ruining people's diets by taking sugar out, that I was removing a food group. That's what I got accused of. I know, an entire food group. And it was, you know, they just went at me and at me and at me. And eventually, over time, I just kept on writing books that sold a lot, and people started to switch. And I just did my thing over here, and I built my own platform. I never relied on Facebook or anything like that. I built my own platform, my own digital content, and just did it that way. And soon enough, I was on the cover of their various magazines, on the cover of their newspapers, and it was, I think it's that Eisenhower quote, you know, first something is ridiculed, then it's something, and then it's accepted as fact. And that's how it generally rolls. And so we've just got to keep doing that. And absolutely never press subscribe on a Murdoch press. Just go, oh, well, I'm not meant to read it when someone sends you a link and it comes up with their big paywall. I'm
going to be super unpopular and say I think we've already won, and it's not about big arguments, it's about small arguments. Last year, a gentleman who was going to be here, shan't be named, actually, who works at the Murdoch Press, invited me to help the Murdoch Press introduce the story of how average Australian households are going to do well, saving money, solving climate change. And I worked with them, and we did rigorous analysis and showed that driving an electric ute will cost you 1 or 2 cents a kilometre, and driving a diesel ute will cost you 15 to 20 cents. And boiling a cup of tea with natural gas costs you 10 cents, and boiling a cup of tea with electric induction stove run off your rooftop solar costs you 1 cent, and having a long hot shower in Victoria using Victoria natural gas costs you 66 cents, and using electric heat pump off the South Australian rooftop solar, it costs you 6 cents to have the same hot shower. And they ran that in essentially the centrefold of the Daily Telegraph in every city in Australia. I strongly believe they are testing that message, and that will go to the US in a few years. They are on a losing wicket. They know it. We're going to win. And you know how we're going to win? We're going to win by showing up at Summer Nats and showing you that the electric ute is better.
Goes really fast.
No,
That's a positive. So we'll end this, draw a line under there. We've got another, I just want to see questions again to the lady up the back.
Hi, thank you very much for this evening. It's been very, very interesting. My name's Maria Bradley. Along with Mira Witt, we're part of a community group called Save Sydney Koalas in Dharawal land, Campbelltown. You may not know, but there's one of the last expanding and chlamydia-free koala populations left in direct conflict with urban sprawl. My question is to Kelly. Can you see any movement on offsets? For those of you that don't know, offset is a system of removing habitat where developers or anybody wanting to remove the habitat can basically replace the habitat or put money into a fund. And so we've seen a net loss of koala habitat through this system. So I'd like to know from Kelly, do you see a shift, an end to that system?
Yeah, good question, because offsets for biodiversity do not work. They are enabling the extinction crisis, and the National Environmental Protection Law is enabling the extinction crisis in Australia. And actually, just a couple of days ago, the offset land for the Sydney airport was torn down for a car park for a Defence Force project. So the offset for the Adani mine was on a piece of land next door that was scheduled to become another coal mine. It's a laugh. It's a joke. It doesn't work. So I do think there's scope for change through the stronger national environmental laws. So there's a big independent review done last year. It's pretty good. The recommendations, we support about 80% of them, which is quite a shock for us. Usually it's much less than that. And what is really great is the business community is also supporting the same reforms as ACF is. And we worked really hard to make that happen because they're seeing both a problem that the laws are problematic for them to be able to develop in Australia, and they're so confusing that development takes a very long time. But also they're seeing that without strong regulation, it's like the EVs as well, without strong regulation, you actually can't bring into this country a whole lot of investment in protecting nature and regenerating nature and taking climate action. And so you'll now see very significant, the Business Council of Australia and the carbon markets organisations all actively arguing for better regulated markets, because that will enable investment in this country. Now, offsets, though, so climate is much easier to offset. Biodiversity is biodiverse and therefore very, very difficult. So I actually personally am not convinced that a market around biodiversity could work, but I really would like to explore it, because I do think we need to unleash billions of dollars of investment in regenerating Australia and our natural world. Governments don't have that much money, and so bringing the business community into that is really important, and credits or offsetting is just one way of doing that. We could just ask Coles and Woolies to only sell sustainable products, which we will be, by the way. We'll be running a new campaign in that, and a campaign on ending fossil fuel donations. So this is a good forum to just develop what we're going to do next.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one more question. I'll go to the gentleman here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Simon. Are we sure that we're actually engaging young people in this whole thing? They're not here. I've been at my nephew's every day who are at the University of Sydney, and I always go, how come you're not burning the place down yet? Like, we all benefited from free education, and you guys aren't, and it's getting more expensive, and the MD or CEO of the place is now on 1.3 million. Like, I don't know. Are we, or are we? Are they at home getting cross over their Instagram
Nadina.
feed?
Nadina, I think would be good. You're a professor.
I'm seeing them at the rallies, and they're turning up in droves, and the school children. So we had an event last year in between one of the many lockdowns, and we had 80,000 people in the domain. So they are out there. They're not visible to mainstream media. They don't engage with mainstream media. and they see mainstream media as fake news.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It brings in TikTok again, doesn't it? Does
That
anyone
feeds back into, government policies of re-endorsing this loop of kind of BS that just pushes one agenda to kind of work as a collective propaganda tool. So they're very active out there, yeah. And they have all quite sophisticated ways of working in their communities.
It's very sophisticated, and some of the stuff is, very, very clever, and it doesn't necessarily look like protest. It's often irony and, sarcasm and paradox and so on. It's a new type of communicating and not always identifiable. But I find that they're definitely out there. One of my second largest male audience is under 20s, under 20 young men. The third largest is men over 65. I don't know what to make of that.
My concern, as somebody who, with very clear eyes, understands that the carbon problem is an energy problem, the majority of energy cost is regulatory burden. And we have not set a level playing field, so the solutions are unfairly not subsidised, etc., etc. And I do think the kids are going to the rallies, and I love that engagement, but they're not showing up with any voice in the very important policy forums and regulation forums. We spent 130, 140 years, because it was a good idea at the time, writing everything from local building codes to state electricity generation transmission rules to federal energy policy in favour of the thing that we thought was a good idea 120 years ago. They're all written and encoded in every single thing you do in your daily life, down to when you're permitting your new solar and how much it costs to disconnect the gas. We have to win every single one of those regulatory battles, and unfortunately the young people are not as engaged as I think they need to be at winning every single one of those battles. We should be having the children should be showing up and overthrowing every local council in Australia and getting on the boards. That's what we need to happen.
I would say this federal election, there's been a record number of 18 to 24-year-olds enrolled to vote. So I feel really positive about that question. I think they are here. They're not here in the room, which is something, we are working on. We're doing everything we can to reach the new audiences for ACF. Yeah, it's Friday night. Yeah, it's Friday night. They also had the Sydney strike today. There was thousands of school students out on the street today. So this is a different approach to climate solutions. Look, is there anything else anyone would like to add from the panel? Something they've a burning desire to get something off their chest that they haven't already?
Can I add something? Because it's not the most exciting election campaign I've ever seen in my life that we're witnessing now. And we say we need leadership, but I'm not sure that we're necessarily seeing that. But I wanted to say that the future is not set. It's sometimes looks grim, but it's not set, right? We shape it. The people who act today shape it. And it's the last president of ACF used to say, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. I quite like that, because it's very true. So everyone here and everyone online tonight, there are hundreds of thousands and not millions of people who think the same way you do out there. And when we realise that together, we are more powerful than we are alone, and we keep coming together, as we're seeing communities do right now about this election, then we will change the future of this country. So it's a bit grim sometimes, but we're acting, and we're going to shape that future, and it's going to be better.
I want to take a stab. You invited us to have...
That's my CEO. I've got to wrap it. No, I'm joking. Go for it.
I just did a book tour around Australia on the issue
Here he
of
goes.
climate.
On his book tour. No, I'm joking. Off you go.
And I took my mum, as you do. I forgot to spend 20 years with her, so I spent a month in the car with her, and it was great. And our first stop was with Helen Haynes, independent, on the Victorian border. She was an amazing woman, and we ended up basically just tailing her for 3 or 4 days. And she is real, genuine, on the ground community politician, and all about community action. And in community after community that we visited with her, it was women, and I'm going to use it as a metaphor, not as exactly true, but like, you get the impression that the Country Women's Association is fed up with the men. They don't have their ego involved with the V8. They understand that it's about the future of the country and the children, and they're making cucumber sandwiches and getting it done. And in some metaphorical sense, I feel like it is an unbelievably intelligent set of very practical, down-to-earth women that are the independents that are just like reluctantly, the only politician I like is a reluctant one, and they're reluctantly engaging because it's time to actually do it the Australian way, which is the men have failed, let's send in the CWA and get the job done. I see that.
So dismantle the patriarchy. Well, I'll put that down as a Together We Can climate solution. Yeah, okay. All right. Folks, I've really enjoyed the discussion tonight. It's been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining. It really does help to have everyday folks in the room. It makes us feel less alone. And just to reiterate ACF's role here, we are the National Environment Organisation. We're a chorus of more than 700,000 voices, and we're always looking for more people to come and join us. Please join me in thanking our brilliant panel tonight. They've been wonderful.